In the still forests of Pine Hollow, a man and his German shepherd uncover something the Earth tried to keep secret for 100 million years. What they find isn't just a fossil, it's a heartbeat trapped in stone. Watch till the end, and if the story moves you, like and subscribe for more. The first frost of October had brushed the hills of northern Colorado, turning the pine needles silver under the slanting morning sun. Henry Cole, 61, moved carefully along the narrow trail, the weight of his tool bag resting on his shoulder. Every step sank into the soft ground as his breath rose in small clouds. Beside him trotted Rex, his old German shepherd Gray, now around the muzzle but still proud in his stride. They had worked these woods for years, side by side, clearing brush after storms, checking fire breaks, trimming the trails no one else used. Henry wasn't paid anymore. He just came because silence was easier to bear here than in town. It just breathed steady and patient the way Henry wished he could. The morning light spilled between the trees, thin and golden, glinting off the dew that clung to the fallen branches. Rex sniffed at the air, ears twitching. Henry smiled faintly. "Yeah, I smell it too," he said. "Snow's coming early this year." The dog's tail wagged once, then stilled. They moved in rhythm like two old friends who no longer needed words. For Henry, the forest was more than work, it was a refuge. After his retirement from the forestry service and the slow unraveling of his marriage, he had settled into this quiet valley outside of Pine Hollow, a small town most folks only passed through. The cabin he lived in had no neighbors within 3 miles, just trees whined and the faint smell of sap that never seemed to fade. He liked it that way. People brought noise. The forest kept secrets. Around mid-afternoon, they reached the ridge where the last storm had knocked down 6 young spruces. Henry started cutting away at the broken limbs, while Rex wandered nearby, occasionally stopping to listen. The sound of the saw mixed with the soft murmur of the wind, a rhythm Henry found strangely comforting. But then Rex froze. His ears pricked forward, his whole body tense. Henry noticed instantly. "What is it, boy?" he asked, shutting off the saw. The forest grew still, the kind of stillness that only came before something happened. Rex let out a low growl and stepped toward a thicket where the soil dipped slightly. Henry followed, heart beating faster, not from fear, but from the instinct that something was off. Rex began to dig at the roots, throwing clumps of wet earth behind him. "Hey, easy leave it," Henry said, but the dog ignored him. After a moment, Henry saw it too, a smooth-rounded surface half buried in the dirt, pale gray and faintly gleaming under the filtered light. It wasn't rock, not exactly. Its surface was too uniform, too deliberate, marked with faint spiral ridges that curved like fingerprints frozen in stone. He crouched down, brushed away the soil with his glove. The texture was almost silky cold, but not dead cold. "What the hell?" he whispered. He tapped it lightly with his knife handle. A hollow thud echoed back. Not solid, not natural. Rex backed away, tail low, ears pressed flat. The dog gave a short, uneasy bark as if warning him. Henry straightened up slowly, eyes scanning the quiet woods. The wind had stopped. Even the birds were silent. For the first time in years, he felt something stir deep inside, a flicker of unease, the kind that had no name. He tied a strip of red cloth to a nearby branch, marking the spot. "We'll look again tomorrow," he said, but his voice didn't sound convincing even to himself. Rex whined softly. "Yeah, I know," Henry muttered. "It doesn't feel right." They walked back to the trail as the light faded, the forest stretching into long blue shadows. The crunch of their boots was the only sound. When they reached the clearing near the cabin, Henry stopped and looked back. Through the darkening trees, he thought he saw the faintest shimmer where the stone lay, buried like moonlight trapped beneath the earth. That night, the wind returned moaning low through the pines. Henry sat by the fire with a cup of coffee, staring into the flames. Rex lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, eyes half open. "What do you think it is, huh?" Henry murmured. The dog didn't move, but his ears twitched at the word "it." Henry leaned back in his chair, the old wood creaking under his weight. He closed his eyes, trying to shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the forest which had always kept its peace had whispered back for the first time. Outside, the branches scratched softly against the roof. Somewhere in the distance, a faint sound echoed through the night. A hollow knock, just once. Henry opened his eyes. The fire popped. Rex lifted his head, staring toward the door. Neither of them moved for a long time. Morning came slow over Pine Hollow, painting the frost-coated branches in pale gold. Henry woke early, as he always did, brewed coffee on the old stove, and stared through the cabin window at the thin mist rising from the trees. Rex sat near the door, tail tapping the floor once, twice, restless. Henry sighed. "You still thinking about that thing, huh?" The dog's ears flicked. He was. So was Henry, though he wouldn't admit it aloud. The forest had always felt predictable, honest in its silence, but that object, whatever it was, had changed something. After breakfast, Henry packed his shovel gloves and a small chisel more out of curiosity than intention. He told himself it was just a rock, nothing more. A mineral oddity washed down from the ridges. But the thought didn't sit right. Rex walked ahead, nose to the ground, leading without being told. The air was crisp, each breath stinging lightly. When they reached the ridge, Henry paused. The strip of red cloth he'd tied yesterday fluttered weakly in the breeze. The soil around it looked disturbed, as if something beneath had shifted overnight. Probably the frost. Henry muttered. Rex whined and began to paw at the earth again. Henry set down his pack, grabbed the shovel, and knelt beside the spot. The first few scoops came up easy, damp and dark. Then the metal hit something smooth. He brushed it off carefully with his glove. The pale gray surface emerged again, cold and faintly gleaming. This time he noticed more thin, symmetrical lines running across the surface like veins, looping and spiraling toward a center point. He frowned. No stone he'd ever seen looked that deliberate. He leaned closer, running his fingertips along one groove. It curved perfectly, too perfect to be an accident of nature. "Could be erosion," he said quietly, as if reasoning with himself. Rex stood rigid, his breath visible in short white bursts. Henry took the chisel and tapped lightly against the side. A deep, hollow sound answered not the dull thunk of solid rock, but a resonant echo, low and empty, like striking the shell of something vast. He froze, listening. Rex's growl rumbled low in his throat. Henry swallowed. "That's odd." He tapped again, softer this time. The same hollow note returned, vibrating faintly through the handle. It was as if the thing beneath wasn't solid at all, but held some cavern of air or memory inside it. The forest, usually alive with small noises, had gone quiet again. Rex barked suddenly, loud and sharp. The sound exploded through the stillness. Instantly, a storm of wings erupted overhead. Flocks of crows, startled finches, a dozen species Henry couldn't name, bursting from the trees all at once, scattering black and brown feathers into the air. For a heartbeat, the sky seemed alive. Then they were gone, leaving only a thin band of low frequency in the air, more felt than heard, something the dog reacted to long before the people did. Henry stood shovel in hand, staring at the stone. His pulse quickened. He felt a faint vibration underfoot, enough to make him step back. Rex barked again, pacing in circles, tail stiff, eyes locked on the exposed surface. "Easy, boy," Henry said, though his own voice trembled slightly. "It's nothing, just a hollow rock." But he didn't believe that. The surface shimmered faintly under the dim light filtering through the trees. Moisture clung to it, beating like sweat on skin. He crouched again, ignoring the chill that crept into his knees. He scraped a little more soil away, uncovering another few inches. The spiral patterns widened, almost like ribs fanning outward. He paused, realizing he was holding his breath. He forced a laugh, a dry sound that vanished into the trees. "You're letting the woods get to you, old man," he whispered. But when he reached to touch the surface again, Rex lunged forward, barking furiously, pushing Henry's arm aside with his head. The dog's fur stood on end eyes fixed on the object. Henry stumbled back, startled by the sudden force. All right," he said, palms raised. Rex continued barking, his voice echoing through the forest like an alarm. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The forest swallowed the sound, leaving only the echo of Henry's breath. The air felt colder. He looked around. The sun had dipped behind a line of clouds, turning the light gray and flat. Rex circled the object once, then sat beside it, refusing to move. Henry stared down at him, unsure whether to scold or thank him. "You really think it's something, don't you?" he murmured. Rex's ears twitched, but he didn't look away. Henry sighed, glanced toward the trail. He didn't know whether to dig deeper or cover it back up. A part of him wanted to walk away, pretend it was just another strange stone the mountain had coughed up. Another part couldn't stop staring at the patterns, the symmetry, the faint suggestion of design in every curve. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the red cloth, again retied it tighter to the branch above, marking the spot as if he were claiming it not for science, not for discovery, but for understanding. The clouds thickened. The wind picked up again, sharp and cold. Henry shouldered his pack, gave the stone one last look, then turned toward the path. Rex followed but kept glancing back every few steps, ears angled toward that silent, hollow thing in the ground. Henry didn't see it, but behind them, where the earth had been disturbed, a thin stream of water seeped through the cracks, dark and slow, tracing the spirals like veins under skin. By the time Henry and Rex reached the cabin, the sky had turned a dull slate gray, the kind of light that made everything look older, quieter. Henry set his pack down by the door, brushed dirt from his sleeves, and filled Rex's bowl with water. The dog drank, but kept lifting his head, listening to something Henry couldn't hear. The man tried to shake off the tension coiled in his chest. It was just a rock. A strange one, sure, but still just a rock. Yet his hands had trembled slightly while unlacing his boots, and the sound of that hollow echo wouldn't leave his head. He built a fire, sat back in his chair, and told himself he was too old to be spooked by silence. The flames crackled, sending orange light across the walls. Rex lay near the hearth, eyes half closed but ears twitching at every creak outside. The wind picked up hissing through the pines as the cabin creaked in the dark. Henry stared into the flames, the memory of the stone spirals swimming in his mind. They weren't random. He knew patterns when he saw them, the kind nature rarely made by accident. He thought about calling the ranger station or maybe the local geology department, but something in him resisted. The forest had given him peace for years. He wasn't about to trade that for noise and questions. Outside, branches scratched against the windows. The wind grew stronger, shifting direction like a restless thing. Henry got up, checked the latch on the door, then looked down at Rex. The dog's eyes glimmered in the firelight, alert now. "Easy, boy," Henry murmured, tossing another log into the flames. "It's just the wind." But the words felt empty. When he finally went to bed, the sound of the storm filled the cabin, trees swaying, shutters rattling, the distant hum of something deeper, slower. Rex curled beside the bed, his breathing steady but shallow. Sometime past midnight, Henry drifted into a restless sleep. He dreamed of the forest as it was that morning, bright and golden, but the ground pulsed beneath his feet as if the mountain itself were breathing. The spiraled stone glowed faintly in the dirt, and when he reached out to touch it, he felt it move. The motion jolted him awake. He sat up in the dark, heart pounding, unsure whether he'd really heard something or imagined it. The cabin was cold, now the fire reduced to embers. The wind had died. The silence was thick, pressing against his ears. Then it came a faint, high-pitched whistle, almost like a breath drawn through a reed. It lasted only a second, maybe two, but it came from beneath the floorboards, not outside. Henry held his breath, listening. Nothing followed. He exhaled slowly, whispering to himself, "Old pipes. That's all." But the cabin had no plumbing left to make that sound. He sat still for a long while, the weight of the dark pressing on him. Then Rex whimpered, soft and uncertain. Henry reached down, resting his hand on the dog's back. "It's all right," he said, though his palm felt the faint tremor running through the animal's muscles. When dawn began to filter through the windows, Henry rose and pulled on his coat. The air had a sharp metallic smell after the storm, and the ground outside shimmered with frost. Rex was already up, pacing near the door. "You need out?" Henry asked, opening it. The dog slipped past him without hesitation and moved toward the edge of the clearing, silent and purposeful. Henry followed, tightening his scarf against the cold. The forest looked scrubbed clean by the wind branches, scattered pine cones cracked underfoot. The red cloth he'd tied yesterday hung limp, its color dulled by dew. Rex stopped halfway between the cabin and the tree line, sat down, and stared toward the direction of the marked ridge. His posture was still ears forward, gaze fixed. He didn't bark or growl. He just watched as if waiting for something to return the stare. Henry squinted through the trees. Nothing moved. The forest stood motionless, the kind of quiet that doesn't belong to morning. "You see something, boy?" he asked, stepping closer. Rex didn't turn his head. His breath came out slow misting in the cold. The sight unsettled Henry more than any noise could have. He looked toward the ridge but saw only the faint shimmer of frost on pine bark. The thought of the hollow sound drifted back into his mind, the echo that had felt too alive. He wanted to believe it was just wind, but he wasn't sure. The sun lifted higher, pale and thin. Henry rubbed his hands together, trying to shake off the chill that wasn't just from the air. Rex finally rose, gave a low, uncertain whine, and walked a few steps forward before stopping again. Henry followed, but the dog halted once more, tail low, eyes never leaving the ridge. The man exhaled, his breath curling in the air. "We'll go back later," he said softly, "after breakfast." But even as he said it, he knew he wouldn't be able to wait that long. Something in the forest had changed overnight, something unseen but awake, and Rex, faithful, stubborn Rex, had felt it first. By mid-morning, Henry could no longer ignore the knot of unease twisting in his gut. The air around the ridge felt heavier somehow, and Rex's strange behavior had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. After 2 cups of coffee and a long silence by the window, he gave in. He drove the 10 miles into Pine Hollow and stopped at the ranger outpost, a weathered wooden cabin with a radio tower leaning slightly to one side. The young clerk at the desk looked surprised to see him. "Morning, Mr. Cole," she said. "Haven't seen you down here since last winter." Henry nodded, removing his cap. "Found something strange up by the North Ridge. Might be worth a look." He explained in his quiet, matter-of-fact way, careful not to sound like a man losing sleep over a rock. The clerk took notes, eyes widening, when he described the spiral ridges and hollow sound. "I'll log it for review," she said. "Probably nothing, but we can flag it to the state geology team." Henry thanked her and left, half hoping they'd forget. But 3 days later, just as the afternoon light thinned, 2 jeeps wound up the dirt road to his cabin. Dust swirled around the tires and Rex barked sharply from the porch. Henry stepped out, squinting, as 4 figures climbed from the vehicles, 3 men and a woman in field jackets, their equipment strapped to the roofs. The woman approached first, extending her hand with a firm grip. "Dr. Margaret Lane," she said, "Paleontology and Earth Systems. You must be Mr. Cole." Henry nodded, a little wary. "That's right. Didn't expect you folks this quick." "We were already in the region," she explained. "Your ranger forwarded the report, and it sounded interesting." Her tone was calm, but her eyes carried that quiet spark of someone who saw the Earth as a story. He led them along the narrow trail toward the marked spot, Rex trotting beside him. The scientists carried scanners, notebooks, and metal cases that clanked softly as they walked. The air was brisk, the light sharp between the pines. When they reached the red cloth marker, Dr. Lane crouched at once, brushing her gloved hand over the exposed surface. "Extraordinary symmetry," she murmured. One of her team, a geochemist named Brian, unpacked a handheld spectrometer and began taking readings. Henry stepped back, arms crossed, watching with quiet tension. Rex sniffed the air, uneasy. "Not volcanic," Brian said after a moment, tapping the display. "Density readings don't match local granite or shale." Dr. Lane frowned slightly. "Let's run a composition scan." They placed small sensors around the stone and waited. The device hummed, lights flickering. A few seconds later, the data scrolled across the tablet in Dr. Lane's hand. She stared at it, her brow tightening. "That can't be right," she whispered. Henry moved closer. "What's wrong?" "It's not purely mineral," she said slowly. "There are organic trace patterns, protein residues, possible tissue fragments." The words hung in the air like fog. Henry blinked. "You mean it was alive?" Dr. Lane didn't answer immediately. Maybe once she said, or something inside it was, Rex barked suddenly loud and sharp, startling everyone. He lunged forward, hackles raised, and barked again, this time deeper warning. "Hey!" Henry caught his collar, pulling him back. The dog strained against his grip, eyes fixed on the stone tail, stiff. "It's all right," Henry said, voice low. "They're just looking." But Rex wouldn't calm. His body trembled, muscles taut. Dr. Lane took a careful step back. "He doesn't like us near it. He doesn't like something near it," Henry corrected quietly. Brian exhaled, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold. "Maybe he smells decomposition gases trapped inside," he said, trying for logic. "Animals react to things like that." But Henry could tell it wasn't scent. It was instinct, something older than reason. Rex's bark echoed off the trees, scattering a pair of jays into flight. Henry felt the eyes of the forest on them again, that same watchful stillness from before. "Maybe you should keep the dog at camp," Dr. Lane said gently. "He's agitated, and will be using equipment that makes noise." Henry hesitated, then nodded. He led Rex back down the trail, tied his leash near the tent they'd set up by the clearing. The dog paced in tight circles, whining softly. "I'll be back soon," Henry murmured, patting his head. "Just rest." When he returned, the team was lowering a thin probe into a crack on the stone side. Dr. Lane crouched beside the scanner, her face lit by its green glow. "The outer shell is denser than granite," she said. "But below that, less so, almost fibrous." "Like bone?" Henry asked. "Not quite," she replied. "More like shell." Her voice faltered, but her eyes gleamed with wonder. The wind stirred the trees, carrying the scent of pine and wet soil. Henry folded his arms, unease rising again. "So, what happens now?" he asked. Dr. Lane looked up thoughtful. "We'll need a few hours to finish mapping it. If the weather holds, we can begin surface imaging tomorrow." Behind them, the sky had begun to dim, the light turning to the pale gray of late afternoon. From the distance came a faint sound, one short muffled bark from Rex. Henry turned instinctively, but Dr. Lane kept her eyes on the stone, her expression unreadable. The machine hummed softly, as if listening. The next morning broke cold and cloudless, the kind of light that made every breath hang long and silver. Frost covered the tents around the clearing, and the forest stood silent except for the low hum of generators starting up. Henry poured coffee from his thermos and handed a cup to Dr. Lane as she reviewed her notes. She looked tired, but focused her eyes sharp with that quiet hunger scientists carried when they stood at the edge of discovery. "We'll start shallow," she said, her voice calm but careful. "Just a single trench to examine the inner structure." Henry nodded, though he wasn't sure if he wanted to see what was inside. The forest had been uneasy all morning, the air too still, the birds gone. Rex lay tethered by the camp, watching every movement, his body tense as wire. When the cutting tool came out, a compact rotary blade designed for precision rock, sampling the sound of its first whir, broke the morning like a wound. The blade met the stone, and immediately a low, deep tone vibrated through the ground, not loud, but resonant. A hum that crawled up through Henry's boots and into his bones. Dr. Lane froze, one hand raised. The team stopped moving, the generator still humming behind them. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The sound lingered, then faded as quickly as it had come, leaving only the faint echo of metal against earth. "Seismic feedback," Brian offered uncertainly. "No tremors in the readings," Dr. Lane replied, her voice hushed. "That wasn't from the ground. That came from the object." She gestured for the work to continue, but slower now. The blade resumed shaving away a thin layer of the gray surface. Dust drifted into the air, glittering faintly in the light. As the outer crust peeled off, something began to show beneath, smooth curved and patterned in precise coiling ridges. The workers exchanged glances as Henry stepped closer. What lay underneath wasn't random mineral. It was structure, a vast spiral turning inward as though the earth had frozen a motion in time. It's not rock," Brian whispered, awe threading through his voice. Dr. Lane knelt beside the incision, brushing away the dust with her gloved fingers. Shell, she murmured, or something close to it. The light hit the exposed surface and shimmered faintly, a muted reflection that danced across their faces like ripples of water. The color wasn't quite white, not quite silver, a pale opalescent sheen, soft and alive. Henry felt his throat tighten. It looked fragile, delicate, even like something that should have stayed buried. The others seemed transfixed. Even the air felt heavier, as if the forest were leaning closer to listen. "It's biological," Dr. Lane said finally, her voice shaking just enough for Henry to notice. "Fossilized at some point, but the preservation—" "It's impossible." She looked up at him, eyes wide. "You said you found it partly uncovered." Henry nodded. "A few inches showing, that's all." "Then the exposure might have started a chemical change," she said, thinking aloud. "This material, it's reacting to the air." She lifted a small light from her kit and shone it across the spiral. The reflection deepened into a soft glow, faint but undeniable. "See that," she whispered. The others nodded silently. The shell seemed to breathe under the light, catching and bending it in slow waves of color. Henry took an involuntary step back. He noticed his own reflection in the curve, stretched and warped like a figure trapped in glass. Dr. Lane reached out carefully, her gloved hand trembling slightly, and touched the surface near the incision. A fine vibration pulsed beneath her fingertips. "It's dense," she said, "but not inert." Brian looked at her uneasily. "You mean it's active?" "Not alive," she corrected quickly, "just reactive, like a mineral that remembers being alive." The generator flickered once, the light dipping. Henry glanced toward the camp where Rex had begun to bark again, short, sharp bursts that echoed through the trees. The sound made one of the technicians drop his notebook. "Leave him," Dr. Lane said, though her own voice was thin now. "Animals pick up frequencies we don't." Henry stared at the shimmering spiral, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The ridges looked ancient. Worn smooth by time, yet every curve carried intention and order that defied randomness. He crouched beside Dr. Lane, studying the surface. The shell's spirals drew inward to a darkened core, a hollow that seemed almost to breathe. "It's like it's listening," he said quietly. She gave him a small, distracted smile, or waiting. The breeze stirred then, a rare sound after so many still hours. It moved through the trees and over the clearing, and for a heartbeat the faint glow dimmed as if the thing beneath had taken a breath. No one spoke. The forest had gone utterly still again, even the hum of the machines fading beneath the weight of that silence. Henry glanced toward the tree line where Rex's barking had stopped. The dog stood stiff, staring at them from the distance. His ears flattened, his body trembling. Henry's eyes followed Rex's gaze back to the object, and he saw it, the light from the lamp catching once more on the spiral's inner edge, flashing a thin band of pale opal that rippled like water under moonlight. It wasn't bright, but it was enough to make the entire team pause, enough to make the clearing feel like a place that time had briefly forgotten. By afternoon, the clearing had turned into a field laboratory. The air was filled with the quiet clatter of tools, the steady murmur of scientific language, and the occasional rustle of pine needles shifting under the light breeze. The object, if it could still be called that, was now half revealed, its full curvature exposed to the pale sunlight. Layers of dirt had been carefully brushed away, revealing the elegant coils of what appeared to be an enormous shell, its ridges looping inward in a pattern too intricate to belong to stone. Henry stood several yards back, his arms crossed, watching silently as Dr. Lane and her team circled the find like cautious explorers approaching the ruins of another world. Rex had returned to his side. The dog no longer barked, no longer paced. He simply sat beside Henry, eyes fixed on the shimmering shape in the center of the clearing. His breathing was slow but deliberate, as though he understood something his master did not. Henry rested his hand lightly on Rex's head, feeling the faint tremor beneath the dog's fur. "You all right, boy?" he murmured. Rex's ears twitched, but his gaze never wavered. The hum of machinery filled the air as Dr. Lane directed her team. "Clear the right side, another half-foot," she said softly, not wanting to disturb the fragile stillness. "Let's see how deep the spiral extends." Her words felt more like a whisper in a church than an order on a worksite. As they brushed away another layer, the details sharpened, the shell's ridges smoothed by time streaked with veins of color, muted gold, pale green, the faintest hint of blue-gray. It gleamed like something between bone and pearl. "I've never seen fossilization like this," Brian said quietly. "The preservation is perfect." Dr. Lane nodded, eyes shining. "It must have been sealed completely from oxygen. That's the only explanation." Henry shifted his weight uneasily. "Sealed," he repeated, glancing toward the shell. "You mean buried alive?" The words came out before he could stop them. Dr. Lane hesitated. "Not alive," she said gently, "just preserved." Like it was meant to wait. The way she said it made Henry's stomach tighten. The forest seemed to lean closer around them, the tall pines standing as silent witnesses. The air smelled faintly of sap and something else, something damp old, almost earthy in a way that didn't belong to surface soil. "Hold the light steady," Dr. Lane said to one of the assistants. The beam of the work lamp slid across the shell's surface, catching on a small crack near the center curve. "There," she said. See that Brian leaned closer. "Fracture line." Maybe she said, already reaching for a fine brush. Or maybe it's... The bristles swept gently across the fissure, and a small flake broke free no bigger than a coin. Beneath it, something pale gleamed. Not gray like stone, not even pearlescent like the shell above, but ivory, smooth and faintly translucent, like the inside of a bird's egg. "Careful," Dr. Lane warned. "Don't touch it yet." But Henry had already stepped closer without meaning to, his boots crunching softly in the dirt. He couldn't take his eyes off the spot of ivory showing through the crack. It didn't look ancient. It looked tender. Fresh. "Is that part of it?" he asked, voice low. "It's a sublayer, Doctor," Lane said, studying it. "Maybe the inner shell, or a different material entirely. We'll need to sample it." She nodded to Brian, who bent down with a scalpel and tweezers. The blade touched the edge of the ivory flake, and as he lifted, a faint sound escaped, a soft hiss, almost too quiet to hear, like air escaping from a sealed jar. Everyone froze. A smell drifted out, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't rot. It wasn't chemical. It was the smell of wet earth, of moss and clay after rain, of something that had been buried too long and was remembering the air again. Henry smelled it first, the scent of something long buried but not gone. "It smells," one of the younger assistants whispered, alive. Dr. Lane didn't respond. Her eyes had gone distant, calculating but also uncertain. "Record this," she said quietly. "We need to document everything before we continue." The forest was utterly still now. Even the wind had gone silent. Henry could hear his own heartbeat, could feel Rex's shoulder press lightly against his leg. The dog's nose quivered, testing the air. His ears flicked back once, then forward again, and a low, uneasy whine slipped from his throat. Henry crouched beside him, whispering, "It's all right." But the words rang hollow. He wasn't sure whom he was trying to comfort. Dr. Lane leaned closer to the opening, her light gliding over the exposed ivory. "The inner texture, it's porous," she said, wonder overtaking her caution. "Almost organic, like it once held moisture." Brian sniffed the air, uneasy. That smell, could it be trapped gases? She shook her head slowly. "No. That's not sulfur or methane. That's soil." She turned to Henry, her voice dropping. Whatever this was, it came from a world that knew rain and wind. It didn't belong to stone. Henry looked at the glistening fissure again, at that pale, fragile surface peeking through. He thought about how easily it had flaked away, how thin the line was between untouched time and the moment something finally sees light again. "You think it's been down here all this time, just waiting for someone to dig it up?" he asked, quietly. Dr. Lane smiled faintly, not looking at him. "Maybe not waiting," she said, "maybe enduring." The breeze stirred again, then faint but real, carrying that same scent of wet soil through the clearing. Rex pressed closer to Henry, eyes wide, and for the first time Henry thought he saw something behind those eyes, recognition maybe, or understanding. The forest didn't move. The light caught once more on the curve of the shell, and the ivory beneath seemed to pulse faintly, as if remembering how to breathe. The following day dawned pale and brittle, the sun little more than a weak coin behind thin veils of cloud. The clearing was quiet except for the soft murmur of Dr. Lane's team preparing their report. Charts and printouts fluttered on the folding table anchored by stones to keep them from blowing away. Henry stood off to the side with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand, his gaze fixed on the shape in the dirt that no longer looked like a stone, but a secret the earth had kept too long. Dr. Lane gathered her team and spoke in that composed, measured tone of someone who understood the gravity of what they'd uncovered. Radiometric testing from the isotopic samples places the specimen at approximately 110 million years old, she said. The words seemed to hang in the air like mist. That puts it in the early Cretaceous. This entire region back then was underwater part of the western interior seaway. Whatever this was, it lived in an ocean that no longer exists. A hush followed. Even the wind seemed to still reluctant to disturb the enormity of that number. One of the assistants asked, could it have fossilized this perfectly under pressure? Dr. Lane nodded slowly. The mineralization is flawless. It must have been encased in sediment, almost instantly shielded from decay. It's miraculous, really. Her eyes shone with awe, but Henry could only feel the weight of what she said pressing into him like the years themselves. A creature that had lived when mountains were seabeds now lay exposed beneath his boots. It was older than thought or grief. He said nothing, only watched as Dr. Lane continued taking notes, her words blending into the hum of machines. Rex lay beside him, at first calm, eyes half closed. But as Henry shifted to set his coffee down and reach towards the shell, the dog lifted his head and gave a low, soft whine. Henry paused, his fingers an inch from the surface. "What's wrong, boy?" Rex whimpered again, the sound deep and uneasy. Henry drew his hand back, and Rex quieted instantly, his tail, still his eyes fixed on the fossil. "He's been doing that since morning," one of the techs said, "every time you go near it." Henry frowned. He's never acted like this before. Dr. Lane looked up briefly. Animals sense vibrations differently. Maybe the shell emits a frequency too low for us to hear. Henry wanted to believe that. He wanted a scientific answer to everything that had begun to feel larger than science. Still, he couldn't shake the way Rex's gaze seemed almost human, pleading. The hours passed, and by late afternoon the team finished their preliminary cataloging. They would transport part of the fossil to Denver for deeper study, but for now they covered it with thermal sheeting and secured the perimeter. Dr. Lane thanked Henry for his cooperation, her tone kind but distant, her mind already deep in data. He nodded politely, but his eyes stayed on the mound under its silver cover. That night the campfire burned low, throwing thin orange light against the tents. Henry sat alone, the distant hum of the generator blending with the whisper of wind through the trees. Rex lay nearby his head, resting on his paws, though he wasn't asleep. Every so often he lifted his head to sniff the air, then lowered it again as if unsettled by something he couldn't name. "You're jumpy tonight," Henry said quietly. "What's gotten into you?" Rex's ears twitched, but he didn't move. The forest stretched endless around them, shadows deepening at its edges. Somewhere far off, an owl called once and fell silent. The fire popped softly, a coal collapsing. Henry stared into it, thinking of Dr. Lane's words, 110 million years. How could something so old still hold so much presence, as if the years between then and now hadn't dulled it at all? He took a sip of cold coffee, his hands steady, though his heart was not. Rex suddenly lifted his head sharply, ears, pricked eyes on the dark line of trees. Henry followed his gaze but saw nothing. "It's just the wind," he said. But the dog stood tense now, tail stiff, and after a moment he bolted into the woods. "Rex," Henry called, standing up, but the sound of paws faded quickly into the distance. He hesitated. Rex had never run off before. Finally, he grabbed a flashlight and started after him, the beam cutting through branches heavy with dew. "Rex, come back, boy." The forest swallowed his voice, returning only the echo of his own breathing. After a few minutes, he heard a rustle ahead. Rex appeared at the edge of the beam, trotting back toward him. Something dark clutched gently in his jaws. Henry crouched as the dog came close, panting softly but unhurt. "What have you got there?" he asked, holding out his hand. Rex set the object down. It was a piece of old wood, long and thin, its surface damp and brittle. The edges were worn smooth like driftwood, though it smelled of soil, not sea. Henry turned it over under the light and froze. Carved into the wood, faint but clear, were 4 uneven words, the grooves filled with age and dirt. "Let what is buried rest." Along one edge ran a single rusted nail hole and a faint triangular stamp, the old ranger mark, suggesting it had once hung as a backcountry warning decades ago. His throat tightened. The phrase looked old, older than any carving he'd seen left in these forests. "Where did you find this?" he whispered, but Rex only sat back, watching him with calm, steady eyes. Henry looked toward the ridge where the fossil lay beneath its cover. The wind moved through the pines again, carrying a faint scent of rain. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of shifting soil whispered like something breathing beneath the earth. The next morning brought a brittle quiet that seemed to cling to the forest like frost. The scientists moved through the clearing with subdued energy, their voices hushed, their gestures deliberate, as though even speaking too loudly might disturb something fragile. Henry stood beside the campfire, coffee untouched, watching as Dr. Lane reviewed the data from the previous day. She looked determined, though the faint lines under her eyes betrayed a restless night. "We need to examine the core," she said finally. "If it's hollow, we'll confirm it before the temperature drops again. The readings suggest a cavity pattern beneath the outer spiral." Henry didn't answer at first. His hands were buried in his coat pockets, his gaze fixed on the silver sheeting that covered the fossil. Rex stood at his side tail low, ears flicking back and forth, watching the team move around the object with quiet intensity. Dr. Lane turned to Henry. "You found it," she said gently. "You've been part of this from the start. I'd like you to stay during the opening." Henry hesitated. "Are you sure that's wise?" She smiled faintly. "Curiosity is what makes it wise." He sighed, the sound more of resignation than agreement, and nodded. "All right," he said softly, "but we do this slow." The team set up their instruments, a portable scanner, fine blades, and temperature sensors. As the sheeting was pulled back, the pale spiral gleamed once again in the weak daylight, its surface beaded with dew that caught the light like glass. Dr. Lane crouched beside the incision they had made earlier, her gloved fingers tracing the line. "We'll widen from here," she instructed. "No deeper than 3 inches until we map the density." The hum of machinery began, a low vibration running through the soil. Henry stepped back, resting one hand on Rex's neck to calm him, though the dog was already trembling. "Easy," Henry whispered. "It's just sound." But Rex's eyes stayed fixed on the fossil, his breath quick and shallow. The rotary tool moved carefully along the existing cut, widening it inch by inch. A soft gray dust rose into the air, and the scent of wet stone and mineral filled the clearing. Dr. Lane wiped her visor and leaned closer. "Almost there," she murmured. "Pressure steady. Keep the speed low." Then the tone changed, a subtle resonant thrum that seemed to rise not from the machine but from inside the shell itself. The sound was brief, almost questioning, like the first note of a song half remembered. "Hold," Dr. Lane commanded. The blade stilled. No one moved. For several seconds, only the wind moved through the trees, brushing pine needles against one another in a faint whisper. "That was internal resonance," Brian said, his voice thin. "Something hollow inside." "Continue," Dr. Lane said quietly, gently. The cut resumed, slower this time. The blade followed the curve, separating a thin fragment of outer shell that came free with a soft crack. As it lifted away, the light fell into the opening, revealing what lay beneath. The air seemed to stop moving. Inside was a hollow chamber, smooth and perfectly shaped, large enough to cradle a child, every contour lined with a faint crystalline film. It was like the inside of an egg, but not calcified, preserved, delicate, impossibly intact. The surface shimmered faintly, reflecting light in waves of soft pearl. "My God," one of the assistants whispered. "It's a cavity, a natural formation." Dr. Lane leaned closer, her breath catching. "Not natural," she said. "It's deliberate. Look at the symmetry. It's a primary body chamber, something that once protected soft tissue, not a nest. Henry stepped forward despite himself. The hollow glistened under the sunlight, and for a moment he could almost imagine warmth inside it, the trace of something once living, once breathing. His pulse quickened. "It's empty," he said, half question, half statement. It was empty, Dr. Lane corrected softly. But this space, this texture, it's biological. This was meant to hold life. Rex gave a low, uneasy growl, the kind that came from deep in the chest. Henry rested a hand on his back. "It's all right, boy." But the dog's body stayed rigid, eyes fixed on the hollow. Dr. Lane turned to her team. "Take readings. Record air density, trace gases, anything we can get." Brian moved closer with a sensor wand. The needle trembled as he held it near the opening. "Trace humidity," he reported. 2% higher inside than out. Dr. Lane frowned. "That's unexpected. It should have been sealed until our cut. The retained moisture suggests long-term isolation." She leaned in, holding the sensor herself. The air near the hollow was cool and heavy, carrying a faint earthy scent Henry couldn't name. It wasn't decay. It was old, clean damp like the breath of rain before it falls. Then it happened. From deep inside the hollow came a faint, almost imperceptible sound, air releasing for a second and then vanishing. Everyone froze. Dr. Lane lifted her head sharply. "Did you hear that?" No one answered. The sound was gone, the air still again. Henry swallowed hard, his throat dry. "That wasn't the wind," he said quietly. Rex's tail dropped, and the dog pressed against Henry's leg, trembling, now eyes wide and unblinking. Dr. Lane stared at the hollow a long time before she spoke again. "Seal the chamber for tonight," she said finally, her voice thin. "We'll continue analysis in the morning." But Henry knew as he looked at that perfect empty space gleaming softly in the dirt that something in there had already awakened, and whatever it was had drawn its first breath in a very long time. For a long while no one spoke. The clearing stood still, suspended between disbelief and awe, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The faint echo of that last sound, the one that had rippled from the hollow like an exhalation of time, still lingered in their ears. Dr. Lane slowly removed her gloves, her movements careful, reverent almost, and set them beside her. The frost in the air glimmered like dust. "Maybe it's not just a fossil," she said quietly. Her voice trembled slightly, not from fear but from realization. "Maybe it's a memory of life itself." No one answered. They didn't have to. The words carried a truth too large to argue with. The shell before them wasn't simply ancient, it was alive in a way that defied breathing, alive in remembrance. Brian lowered his instruments, the soft whir of the sensor fading into silence. Even the generators seemed to hush, as though the machines understood the sanctity of what had been said. Henry stood at the edge of the pit, his coat unbuttoned against the cold, the light falling across his face in pale streaks. His eyes were fixed on the hollow, that perfect cradle carved by time and silence. The idea of something waiting beneath the earth for 100 million years felt almost unbearable. Yet it wasn't horror. He felt it was tenderness, a quiet ache for something that had never truly died. He looked to Rex, who sat close by, come now his head, low ears tilted toward the fossil. "You feel it too, don't you?" Henry murmured. The dog blinked slowly, his breath rising in soft clouds. Dr. Lane turned to Henry. "When you found it," she said, "did you feel something different?" Henry hesitated. "It felt wrong to touch it," he said. "Not dangerous, just like I was interrupting something that didn't want to be disturbed." She nodded slowly. "I know that feeling." Her gaze drifted back to the fossil. "It's strange. We study death for a living extinction decay, but sometimes we forget that life leaves echoes. Maybe that's what this is. The echo that refuses to fade." Her words hung there, fragile, as the mist curling through the trees. The team began to pack their equipment as the light thinned. It was almost dusk now, the air cold enough that each breath turned to silver vapor. Dr. Lane ordered the hollow resealed for transport the next morning. Henry helped them cover it, his gloved hands brushing the cold shell one last time. It felt smoother than stone warmer, even like something that remembered sunlight. Rex watched silently. When the final tarp was tied down and the camp began to quiet, Henry stood for a long time staring at the mound that held the weight of eons. He thought of his own years, the wars, the losses, the quiet mornings alone in the cabin, and realized that time hadn't erased any of it. It had simply folded it away, layer by layer, just as the Earth had done here. Time didn't kill. It kept. It held what mattered until someone came along to remember. "Maybe that's what you were waiting for," he whispered to the shell. "Not to be found, but to be remembered." Rex pressed against his leg a silent affirmation. As the group packed up their remaining tools, Henry started down the path toward camp. Rex followed, but halfway along the trail he paused, turned back toward the clearing, and began to dig softly at the ground. "Hey," Henry said gently, "leave it." But the dog ignored him. His paws moved a slow, deliberate scratching at the cold soil until he'd made a small hollow. Then he stopped, looked once more toward the covered fossil, and used his snout to push the dirt back over the spot as if to bury something unseen. Henry watched his chest tightening. "You're saying goodbye," he murmured. Rex finished his task and returned to Henry's side, his fur brushing against the man's coat. They walked together back to camp in silence. The forest behind them sighed in the wind, the last light slipping between the trees. When Henry glanced over his shoulder, he could still see the faint outline of the clearing through the branches, the tarped shape lying motionless, the red cloth fluttering weakly on its post. That night, snow began to fall fine and dry, covering the tents, the tracks the shovels left leaning against the tree trunks. By dawn, the forest was white and hushed, every sign of human presence erased. Henry stepped outside his tent, his breath clouding in the cold, and saw that the mound where the fossil lay was completely buried beneath a smooth, unbroken sheet of snow. When the storm cleared, Dr. Lane's team returned to complete a controlled excavation, jacketed the specimen in plaster, and prepared it for transport under conservation protocols. Only the strip of red fabric remained half-frozen, marking the place like a memory refusing to vanish. He reached down to pat Rex's head, the dog's fur dusted in white flakes. "Guess it's back to sleep now," he said softly. The forest gave no answer, but somewhere beneath the snow the silence felt older, deeper, as though something beneath had heard and understood. Several months later, with winter settled deep in the Rockies, Pine Hollow lay blanketed in white silence. Henry drove carefully through the winding roads that led into the city, the tires crunching over frozen slush, the faint hum of the heater filling the cab. Rex sat in the passenger seat, his gray muzzle resting on the window frame, watching the landscape slide by, hills and trees lost under sheets of snow. In the distance, Denver rose out of the valley like a mirage of glass and light. Henry hadn't been there in years. He parked near the museum and stood for a long moment before going in, his breath rising in the crisp air. The building's wide stone steps gleamed under the pale sun banners hanging from the entrance reading, "Ancient Lives Unearthed the Fossil of Pine Hollow." Inside the museum smelled faintly of dust and polished wood. The exhibit hall was quiet save for the soft murmur of visitors and the distant echo of footsteps. Henry moved slowly down the corridor until he saw it, the fossil no longer half buried in soil and shadow, but resting beneath pristine glass surrounded by soft lights that gave it an almost sacred glow. It was larger than he remembered, the shell gleaming like pearl underwater, every curve alive with muted color, amber, ivory, silver, and the faintest trace of blue. The placard beside the display read in clean black lettering, "Cretaceous marine mollusk, approximately 110 million years old. Discovered near Pine Hollow, Colorado," and beneath that, in smaller print, "Discovered by Henry Cole and his dog Rex." Henry smiled faintly, his hand tightening around the brim of his hat. "They gave you credit, old boy," he whispered, glancing down at Rex, who sat beside him, tail sweeping once across the polished floor. The dog looked up at him, ears flicking forward, and Henry felt that quiet, steady presence that had always anchored him, the same stillness that had guided him through grief and silence, through years of loneliness. They stood before the glass, their reflections merging with the spiral inside as though time and memory had blurred. A young museum guide nearby spoke softly to a small group of visitors. "It's one of the best preserved specimens ever found," she said. "Scientists believe the preservation was so perfect because it was sealed off right before a sudden geological shift. Essentially, the Earth protected it." Henry listened, his thoughts drifting. Protected it, he repeated in his mind. Yes, that was what the mountain had done, and perhaps what the forest had tried to tell him all along. He bent slightly and whispered near Rex's ear, his voice rough with emotion. "We didn't just find it," he said. "We listened." Rex turned his head slightly as if understanding, then pressed his nose lightly against Henry's coat. Around them, people passed by, pausing only briefly before moving on, but Henry stayed. He couldn't stop looking at the fossil, at its quiet strength, at the way it seemed to pulse faintly under the lights like something that still remembered how to live. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also heavy, carrying within it a weight that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with endurance. After a while, he turned away. As he stepped back into the cold afternoon, snow had begun to fall again, slow and soft, blurring the edges of the city. The drive home was quiet. The road wound higher into the mountains, where the forest waited like an old friend. Dusk had fallen by the time he reached his cabin, the pines bending gently under their burden of snow. Henry parked, stepped out, and breathed in the sharp scent of winter air. Rex leapt from the truck, bounding ahead toward the ridge, his paws leaving deep impressions in the fresh snow. Henry followed him through the silence until they reached a clearing near the old pine tree overlooking the valley, the same place where he'd once tied the red cloth. The forest here was unchanged, timeless in its stillness. The snow glowed faintly in the fading light, and the air carried that same damp scent of soil and pine. Henry knelt near the tree, brushed away a small patch of snow, and set a wooden sign into the ground. The words carved into it were simple. Some things are meant to sleep, and some to remind. He pressed the base firmly into the frozen earth, then stepped back to look at it. The wind moved gently through the branches, scattering snowflakes like ash. Rex came to sit beside him, his fur brushing against Henry's coat, his breath rising in even, steady clouds. "You did good, boy," Henry said softly. "You kept it safe." The dog's eyes followed his, staring out into the wide expanse of trees and white silence. Somewhere far below, a creek murmured beneath the ice. The sound was faint but steady, the same rhythm the forest had always known. Henry stood for a while, his hand resting on Rex's head, his thoughts drifting not backward but deeper into that strange endless stillness that lived between moments. Around him, the snow continued to fall soft and unhurried, covering the tracks behind them until the clearing looked untouched once more. By spring, it would seem nothing had ever happened here, only trees and wind and the faint whisper of water beneath the frozen ground. But Henry knew better. He knew the forest remembered. Beneath the snow, beneath the layers of earth, the fossil lay sleeping once more. Not gone, just resting its spiraled shell, holding within it the breath of a life that had never truly ended. He looked out over the valley, the cold air sharp in his lungs, and for the first time in years he felt at peace. Beside him, Rex exhaled softly, curling into the snow at his feet, eyes half-closed content. The forest settled into quiet again, as if exhaling too, and the night descended gently, wrapping man-dog and mountain alike in the calm of things that endure. What part of Henry and Rex's story touched you the most? The discovery, the silence, or that final moment in the snow? Tell me where you're watching from and what you think really slept beneath Pine Hollow. If this story moved, you don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales that linger long after they end.